What must I say? Hello? What must I do to show how much I think about freaking you? Hello everyone, welcome back to another episode of Vento Aureo. Today we're gonna be looking at episode 5, which is the finale of the Black Sabbath and Pulpo arc, and of course Giorno getting into the gang properly. I literally just finished watching the episode, so I've still got freaking you stuck in my head. So yeah, we start off exactly where the previous episode finished. And last episode we were talking about the divide between the physical self and the ethereal self, the spirit or the soul, and how Pulpo's stand, Black Sabbath, takes advantage of it, both to test people who are trying to enter the gang, as well as we learn later in the episode, to kill people who he thinks are beneath him in a certain way and are trying to make fools of him. So that's a pretty interesting idea. Of course, it gets Mario killed, which is a shame. Black Sabbath in this particular frame looks really, really good, so I'm glad I paused it exactly when I did. But in general, you know, this whole episode has actually quite high quality art. It does suffer a couple of times, but it's nowhere near as consistently bad as the first half of episode 3. So I'll just say that, and then I'll try not to mention art quality all too much, unless I'm really, really quite excited by how good it looks. And see, the fascinating thing about this episode is not only is the art style really good, but it's also brilliantly animated. So you saw there that Black Sabbath, his cloak was actually animated for that entire, and it's like a shortcut, and the animation isn't that extreme, but it's little movements like that that make it feel not like a PowerPoint presentation, which anime is all too easily bent towards. And that's just a fascinating little cut there to just show how unsettling Black Sabbath is, and not just as like this apparition, but also as a stand, because it is a very odd stand in a lot of ways. And I talked about this in the previous episode as well, how it's so divorced from Pulpo, and how not only is it automatic, but it almost seems like Pulpo has no control over it whatsoever, and it can just do whatever it wants, as long as it satisfies the end goal of testing people who see that the lights have been relit. And I'll talk about this later, but it's kind of interesting that it's not just the people who relight the lighter, but anyone who sees the lighter being relit. But yeah, there'll be a time for that in this episode. But so yeah, no, that particular cut I think is really quite interesting, because you get to see the sun first of all. The sun, as I was talking about, is a symbol of Giorno specifically. And, you know, it's not to say that this is a particularly symbolic episode overall, but I do think... hang on, why? Hello? My pen seems to have broken, so this is going to be a little bit annoying. But anyway, it's not to say that there's a lot of symbolism in this particular episode, but, you know, we have talked about how Giorno is the sun, and as the sun is setting, how we approach the end of the day, and how, you know, we're no longer being illuminated by Giorno's righteousness, let's say. What comes out is Black Sabbath, and its first, you know, its immediate task is to kill the old janitor that we saw. And so we immediately associate this as an act of moral repugnance, and later we see Giorno justifying that to kill Pulpo and say, well, there you go, that's a morally justified act, both literally and by the definitions that you yourself, Pulpo, have laid out. So there you go, that's the karma that you get for espousing your twisted beliefs, let's say. Later on in the episode, we'll see multiple times where they actually, you know, they say full on the very next day. Right, so it's like, here's a new opportunity for Giorno to establish who he is as a character as the sun rises. And we see, you know, that motif of the sun rising like multiple times throughout part 5. Because it's so rushed, a lot of the fights actually happen overnight. And especially White Album is perhaps the most evident. And I think the King Crimson fight actually happens just at sunrise as well, where the sun illuminates the path for the Gangstars at the same time as Giorno actually saves, you know, whoever's fighting from, you know, certain death or something. I mean, like, that's certainly the case for Mista. So it's very interesting to see this symbolism, and to see that Black Sabbath is portrayed as a foil, as such a strong foil to Giorno. And I think this is really good writing, because you want to establish who your protagonist is. What better way to characterize your protagonist by having him fight against an antagonist that is directly his opposite, right? So you put someone up there and you say, this is our antagonist, and you can recognize his evils and you can see what's wrong about him. And then you say, well, this is our protagonist, and it's exactly not this person that we're talking about. And JoJo, you know, I think failed to do that with parts 2, part 3, and part 4. So it's really nice to see a part kind of returning to the strong character establishment that we saw in part 1. It's not done so apparently, unless we really focus on the later parts of the episode, where we do see that Giorno kills Polpo specifically because of the morally corrupt actions that he committed. But then we do see, dare I say, shadows of it here, with a little bit of symbolism. And this particular cut is very, very smoothly animated. The way like the CG and the backgrounds and Black Sabbath itself is all composited so smoothly, and Black Sabbath itself is animated really nicely. As I was talking about in episode 3, you know, you do see some of the flat shading on Black Sabbath, and that again, like, that's a pretty cool aesthetic, coupled with, you know, the fact that they are still using highlights and they are going like crazy with the shadows and everything, and the use of black here. Ah, beautiful. Yeah, this particular shot I think has a lot to say, and it does say it quite well. So I'm really happy to see that. Okay, this is actually really annoying, so I'm gonna figure out why this isn't working. Okay, I figured it out. Being an idiot, apparently I turned off my keyboard and I didn't notice at all. Okay, so hopefully that works now. And clear, beautiful. Wow. It's like magic, you know, but it's just me being an idiot. So yeah, beautiful cut. And I like how Black Sabbath doesn't actually notice Giorno at all until Giorno himself steps in the shadows. And so that's another thing that's really interesting. Black Sabbath hunts people who see the flame being relit, but he can't actually see the people at all until they themselves step in the shadow. So it's like you have to see the light and then step back into the shadow for this test to be undertaken upon you. There's something there that's very poetic, and I'm not sure what it is, but I think it's very deliberate. That was a really... This entire section is, I think, really oddly cut, and I think not very smoothly animated. It's like they forgot to have some in-between frames, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. Black Sabbath looks really cool here, but I don't know if this is off-model or not, but frankly I don't care, because I just think the way this cloak is just all over the place, and you can see how gaunt he is. It's really, really cool, and a bit freaky, to be honest. And this in particular is very smoothly animated, right? Like, it's basically redrawn frame by frame. And I've talked about this before, especially with Koichi. Like, you don't need to redraw every little thing frame by frame as long as you get the spirit of the thing through. But here they do choose to do it, and I'm not sure why specifically. I guess if you kind of just showed this frame by itself, it does read a bit awkwardly. Why exactly is Giorno just like balancing on one hand? And so at least you get the illusion of weight, right, being given to the character. So that here, when we do just see him sliding across the screen, it feels a bit more natural and it doesn't seem so forced, right? So I guess it does lend itself to the editing a bit better, but at what effort, right? Because I did say, you know, the editing is a bit clumsy, and I feel like it's the focusing on very specific still frames versus larger, more fluid, greater amount of keyframes that I think makes the editing feel a bit stilted. See, so then there we actually did get some keyframes, and it doesn't feel so weightless as, for example, when we saw Polpo rushing towards Giorno, right? So here, you know, we do get some really well animated keyframes, but then here we see his and coming in, and then it just kind of like jump cuts to Giorno immediately making this expression, and it's like, okay, that kind of came out of nowhere. And then it jump cuts once again to Polpo missing, and then it seems like Giorno didn't dodge out of the way so much as Polpo just blatantly missed. Or Black Sabbath, rather, I should say. And then that cut there as well, where it's just like you see Giorno's legs just suddenly like flying across the screen for like the slightest frame, and it's like, wait, what just happened? And then you cut back and then you get this, and it's like, okay, that's not the smoothest animation and the smoothest editing that we could have hoped for. And so it's like, what is the action that you're trying to communicate? And that's something that I've been talking about for part 5 since episode 2 now. So I hope this isn't gonna be like a consistent topic, but I really feel like part 5 has lost the sense of fluid action, and it's all just about, we go from one cut to the next cut to the next cut, one pose to the next pose to the next pose, without any sort of transition through them. And it's not as rewarding to watch that kind of action, I think. It's much more natural in manga, where your mind is meant to fill in the gaps. If you've read Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics, you'll know he talks about closure. Closure is the effect that even though you've only seen the frames, you can imagine what happens in between. So you can see the full picture despite being deprived of the full picture by only seeing small details of that full picture. So that's closure. It works really well for manga, and it doesn't work as well for film, for example, which uses 24 frames per second. So if every frame is a completely different image, it's hard to resolve that into a single greater image, right? And similarly with anime, if you don't allow the viewer to connect every single frame of your animation fluidly, then you don't really attach them together into a cohesive narrative. And I feel like that's what Vento Aureo is suffering with. But then there's stuff like this, for example, where Bruno does actually, you know, like swing his legs around and then plant them, hang on, and then plant them firmly on here. And it's like, yes, I get that. I get that action very naturally. Like, I don't need to think about it. It just clicks, right? So, and then this, it's like, okay, he reaches out, but then like, what's he got a grip of? Because nothing on Giorno's clothes looked particularly of this color. And I guess that is kind of the effect that they're trying to do. Like, how has he gripped Giorno when, you know, this doesn't look like Giorno at all? But then they never really show a good frame of the fact that it is his shadow. And you can only really infer from little implications like the fact that this shadow is rapidly, you know, moving. That the line art on this shadow is rapidly moving. And it's like, okay, so he grabbed his shadow instead? And that question mark shouldn't be there, right? But Vento Aureo doesn't make it quite apparent to the viewer, and so now we do have a question mark in our heads. And that's happened for 3 episodes straight now. So the action, I'm really quite worried about how the action is being portrayed for this particular series, because it's never felt all too rewarding. I love Giorno's yell in the background. It's like a solid 5-second yell. And then like we don't even really get to see what he's got a grip on, versus back in the earlier parts of the episode we saw when he gripped Mario's soul, it was like, yes, that is Mario's soul. Like it was made very apparent. But then if we go back a second, like we see the face, but we really only see like the slightest hints of a silhouette here, and it's like, is this meant to be Giorno? What is this meant to be precisely? You could take it another way and you could say, well, it's Gold Experience and Giorno's soul at the same time, so no wonder it's a bit confused about which one it is, because it's trying to resolve that, right? Like, is Gold Experience actually Giorno's soul? Is the soul a separate entity from whatever Black Sabbath just grabbed out of Giorno? And right now, you know, it is still in that space of confusion, where maybe it does resolve into Giorno's face, as Mario's soul resembled Mario's face. But then later we do see that it resolves into Gold Experience. So it's like, maybe this is the moment where Giorno actually fully appreciates what a stand is. And in any case, it's a really good visualization of what a stand is. So for example, say you've never read JoJo's Bizarre Adventure before. You buy Shonen Jump because you hear there's a new part and it's set in Italy and it's about gangsters and stuff. So you've been reading this for like a few chapters now and you're like, what the hell are these stand things? And you read that Black Sabbath can pull people's souls out of them. Well, what does he pull out of Giorno? He pulls out his soul, but it's in the shape of his stand. And that's a very easy way to make equal the distinction between stand and soul. It's like, well, there is no distinction. Your stand is your soul. Your very character and your very essence are all baked into your stand. So your power and your cruelties and your values and your righteousness, all of these things are baked right into you know, your stand power, your stand design, what you use your stand for, so your stand's actions, all this stuff. So it's a really, I guess you could say that it's quality visual communication, right? And, you know, being a manga, as opposed to, you know, being like a novel series or something, JoJo obviously needs to communicate things through visual language. It can't say all these little facets of what a stand is just by, you know, like splurging out a series of words. Like, it has to communicate visually. And with this particular case, I think it does that very, very well. So there you go. It resolves into Gold Experience is, I think, a really good way of thinking about it. Because, you know, like you can see in certain stands, for example, and Purple Haze in Purple Haze Feedback is really quite good at this. People don't want to accept their soul sometimes. They feel a distinction from who they really are as a human being, and they want to change and they want to be different people, but it's like, well, you can't change who you are as a human being. You can really only change your expression of it and the persona that you express to other people. And that's one way of thinking about it. And in fact, I think it is such a powerful act to change who you are as a person that the only thing that can catalyze it, in Araki's language in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, I think, the only thing that can catalyze a change of the soul is the stand arrow, and that's what it truly means to be chosen. It's not that the arrow thinks you're worthy of having a Requiem stand, rather it's you are deeply desirous of changing yourself, of changing who you are as a person. Specifically, when we get to the end of Act 5, I think that's exactly what's happening to Giorno and to Polnareff. Like, they've developed such a great need that they've sacrificed the self that they were before for the sake of the self that they would like to be in the future, right? And they're willing to change the core of themselves, whether you call it the spirit or the soul or the stand. As soon as that changes, you're not the same person anymore. I actually have a video talking about Koichi's Act 1, Act 2, Act 3 changes, as well as Trish and how she learns to manifest Spice Girl as well. And it's very much the same idea, I just don't talk about it in the context of the stand arrow. So if you want to see that video, then there'll be a link to it in the description, if I can remember. And there will also be a link to it at the end of the video. So yeah, Giorno resolves, you know, his soul and his stand into the same entity. I think that's what this is representing. Like, he hasn't divorced those two things. And, you know, now that I say it like that, I think Polpo actually has, you know, like, to him, Black Sabbath and himself aren't the same entity, which is why he can do this kind of thing, which is why he can have automated stands. And I dare say anyone with automated stands probably has some kind of incredibly strong disconnect between the public face that they put on. You know, for example, Polpo has this affectation of being pleasant and trustworthy and jovial and, you know, like fat, right? Whereas his stand, Black Sabbath, is really an incredibly fast stand that hides all the time, right? Like, there's no affectation whatsoever because he doesn't even have a public presence. The only way Black Sabbath knows how to fight is by hiding in the shadows. And so that distinction between who the ego is and who the id is so distinct that the stand basically has to automate itself to even exist. And so in that way, I dare say it's a bit like split personality. But I wouldn't take it that far. I wouldn't say that literally, I think. It's a good metaphor, but it's not a good diagnosis, let's say. And in fact, you know, they do mention Kira. They do mention Kira in this episode, which was really hype. Kira similarly had an automatic stand. And he's kind of the definition in JoJo of someone who's, you know, very good at providing that facade. And so to equate the way Black Sabbath acts with the way that Kira's sheer heart attack work is, I think, a little bit of genius, but also me just kind of like extending my arguments to other cases. That being said, split personality disorder, I mean, like, we see in part 5 that Diavolo has split personality disorder, and we never really get an automatic stand out of King Crimson. But again, like, that wasn't necessarily my point. I'm not saying that people with split personality disorder have automatic stands, but rather having an automatic stand is like having split personality. Does that make sense? Hopefully it does. That phrase, does that make sense, I feel like I've gotten really familiar with, because I'm just ranting out stupid ideas and kind of crazy off-the-wall ideas to you. And to say, does that make sense, kind of makes it feel like forgivable that I'm just saying random shit and expecting you guys to follow along or understand or be interested at all. Before we continue, I just quickly wanted to say the golden lines again, looking really good. They're kind of tying in the all the stuff that I was so excited about with the stand summoning animations, with the actual stand itself, and now you can see like how the effects are layering on top of each other to look really good. And in fact, look at his eyes. Oh, that looks so good. This genuinely looks like it comes out of like an 80s OVA or something. Like, you look at Gunbuster, you look at the aesthetic that it had, you look at Macross, especially the movie, Do You Remember Love? This kind of like markered aesthetic. It's so good, it's so good. And like the way they're tying that in with digital effects, like all this smoky stuff, brilliant, so good. There you go, more golden lines, looks really good. Black Sabbath also with the flat shading, but it's also still got like actual, you know, like multi-tone shading. This hand I'm just going to point out. I'm not going to say anything about it just yet, but I'm just going to point it out because one of the things that this hand could be referencing, I think, actually shows up in this episode. So I'll just, you know, say, I wonder what this could represent. And yes, my opening analysis video is still coming up, so don't worry about that. I haven't forgotten about that. So yeah, to go back to what I was talking about, there's Black Sabbath is very insistent that everybody stabbed by the arrow has two paths. One of being chosen, which I've already talked about, is kind of like an expression of wanting to change yourself for the better in a way, right? And the other path is death. And so it's really interesting to me that Giorno is immediately harmed by the arrow as soon as he touches it. So it's kind of like saying that Giorno right now isn't in that place where he can meaningfully grow as a human being if he gets stabbed by the arrow. So he has like zero chance of being chosen whatsoever. And I think that's a really interesting place for Giorno to be, because we know Giorno's ambition, right? Like we know how determined he is to become the boss of Passione. But to try and get there without being chosen is like saying, I don't need to become a better person. It's like hubris, you know, except for the fact that Giorno doesn't suffer for it. So it is an overwhelming amount of arrogance on Giorno's part to say that I can become the boss just the way that I am, that I don't need the power of the stand arrow. Not that he knows that the stand arrow has any power at this point, but you kind of get the idea. Like, he doesn't need to become a better person, and he doesn't need to grow. He can overthrow the boss of Passione and become the new leader just by himself, with a little bit of help from Bucciarati. So it's a really interesting place for him to be, that later on in the story, when he knows what Diavolo's power is, he is far less certain about the probability. And of course, he's witnessed a few of his friends' death at that point. So kind of like Jotaro, right? Like he's determined to fight, but it's driven by self-doubt, a little bit of self-hatred maybe even, and a lot of fear. But you know, we'll talk about that more when we actually get to those episodes. But in any case, it's very natural that at that point, obviously, Giorno's trying to find within himself a better person, which when he finds the Requiem arrow, it's like, there you go, you've gotten everything you could possibly want. And Diavolo, obviously, it would make sense why Diavolo, of all people, would find the Requiem arrow and just not get anything out of it, because who the hell expects Diavolo to think, hey, I'm not the strongest person I could be, right? Like, that's the kind of hubris that a lot of JoJo villains suffer from. And I actually mentioned this in the Diesel video as well, so there you go, that's another video for you to watch if you're new to my channel. And that'll be in the description and the end cards as well, so yeah. Yaboenai! 僕の夢を阻み、あのじいさんのように関係ないものをゴミくずのように殺すやつであるのならば倒さねばならない。Oh yeah, baby! Oh, buta 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 buta! Oh, yes! Gold experience. They totally nailed it. So good. And it's like, that entire sequence is like a page and you don't really pay attention to it because it's like, you know, it's not his first Muda rush, right? But at the same time, it is his first meaningful Muda rush where he's actually like trying to beat his enemy as quickly as possible. And, you know, he even does his special power, let's say, that I don't think ever gets used again after this episode. It might be though, I don't know, I really don't remember. And in any case, it doesn't work, so it doesn't really matter. And in fact, it's kind of odd that he tried using it on a stand, because previously he used it on Bucciarati's flesh. And the reason for that is because the flesh is meaningfully a living thing, right? Whereas is a stand a living thing? That's a much more debatable and arguable comment. It's fascinating that this worked at all, in my opinion, that that Giorno's stand power that should only affect living things also affects the souls of living things. And maybe that's one of the reasons why Gold Experience Requiem actually works the way it does. But yeah, like that's thinking way, way, way too ahead, I think. But yeah, no, they really nailed that stand rush. The visuals, so good. I mean, talk about like weighting the action. Every single little moment in this small interaction is weighted by such a huge amount of animation. Like you see here, it starts up on his face. And then basically, we see every little movement that Gold Experience does. We see him, you know, clench, his fists is clenched, which immediately sets up the aggression that Giorno is about to show. We see, of course, the fist being raised ever so slightly. The movement of it is foreshadowed in a way, like it's led into, and then we get this huge cut of a very simple action, right? Like it really doesn't show much at all, but it needs to happen. Because that's a big punch that just landed on Black Sabbath, and you can feel that punch, and it's a big, satisfying, meaty, fuck you punch, right? Oh, and the sound effects, and the speed lines on the fist, and the blood coming out of Black Sabbath, and the way his head is still like rolling, and in fact that's like animated frame by frame, and it's not just they're using like a cutout of Black Sabbath just to like roll his head like this. Like they're actually redrawing that, which looks super cool, and you can tell from the lines especially. And then he grabs the cloak and then he kicks the thing, and you can tell something massive is happening, but you're not sure what. But then even then, you know, they're still waiting every little moment of it. Like every little facet of it is anticipated. There you go. That's the animation word for it. It's one of the 12 principles of animation. Anticipation. And like circular motion and all this other stuff, which I don't need to get into. But if you're curious, then you can Google that, I suppose. The 12 principles of animation. But you know, like everything's anticipated. And there's nothing that feels out of place because they give it screen time that they need to make it feel believable and weighty. And then you get to the muda muda and it's like... Thank you, David Production. Absolute legends. God, so good. And then this, like the way they set all of this up, it's just like, as Bruno's talking about what exactly he's just done, and you'll notice like the RGB tearing has returned, which signifies Giorno's special power that he never uses again. As all of this is happening, they're still showing Black Sabbath, right? And so there's this immediate continuation of action and thoughts, which gets very suddenly interrupted by that. And it's like, oh, wait, what? And that's a really good communication of confusion, because now we feel confused. And this is the issue that I had in episode 3 when they when Pulpo bit off his fingers. Like, we never got that moment where it's like, what just happened? Because they never communicated it as clearly as this. There's no continuation of action and thought in that particular scene. And the only part where we really understand that something's gone weird is when Giorno specifically says, oh my god, what, that was weird. And we're like, was it weird? I guess it was. Whereas this is like, yes, it is weird. And it's very obviously weird. And Giorno surely didn't expect it, because Giorno was very obviously winning, because they set it up. You know, they had like all these big swings and all these big muda 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 moments, and this giant arms. It's like everything is set up perfectly to show that Giorno is winning, and it's like, hell yes, Giorno's winning, muda muda muda. And you can even tell by the poses like who's victorious at this point and who's winning and who's got the upper hand. So when Black Sabbath suddenly disappears, it's like, wait, oh no, turns out Black Sabbath knew the kind of crazy stuff that he was doing all along, and you were just being played. They set it up really, really well, is I guess the point I'm trying to make. And it pays off, and it's the first time where the action actually feels like it triggered the emotions that it wanted to, let's say. And it was also very fluid and smooth animation, which doesn't hurt. But more than that, the editing as well, and the action. I was complaining about this earlier in the episode. The editing really lends itself to communicate that action very, very well. So there you go. It's like Vento Aureo can do it, they just choose not to, because I don't know why. You know, like you could say they're saving money, or you can say like, you know, the particular director who worked on the earlier scenes, or the animator who worked on the earlier scenes didn't get to put in this much detail for whatever reason. Maybe they were lazy. I don't want to say that though. Maybe they just ran out of time or something. I'm actually more curious what changes they're willing to make when the Blu-rays come out. Whether it's just art style changes that they're content with, or if they'll actually add cuts and shots and animation frames, right, and keyframes to make some of this action flow a bit smoother. It really does seem like they're pretty happy with what they're releasing. And it doesn't feel like something's missing so much as they just chose not to do the stuff that I think is important. And again, really good editing there. The focus is on the confusion, right? And this happened in episode 1 with Koichi as well. Like, the confusion was with the briefcase turning into the frog. So you see the frog and it's like, what is that? But you also need to focus on Giorno's reaction, because we need to know that Giorno thinks this is also weird. It's not just us being very confused about the bizarreness of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And I love that they both move at the same time. That's the kind of stuff that stands should constantly be doing, in my opinion, but most of the time they're just floating around in the background, and it's nowhere near as satisfying as that little shot that you just saw there. Here we see the image of the sun, and it's even more powerful, and it's even more radiant, and it actually pushes Black Sabbath away from, you know, essentially Giorno's death, right? Like, that would have been the end of Vento Aureo if the sun hadn't, you know, suddenly exercised its power upon Black Sabbath and warded him away, and had it weaken its grasp on Giorno. So it's kind of like, in the Q&A video that I did yesterday, it's we talked about how Giorno is kind of like a divine character, and it's not that I necessarily agree with that, but stuff like this like really helps to support that symbolism. It's like, yeah, you know, whenever Giorno's in trouble, literally the sun itself and natural circumstances will provide Giorno the opportunity to make it out alive. And it's like, what is that if not divine intervention or Deus Ex Machina? It's kind of interesting also that the sun is exactly the thing that Dio died to in the end, right? Like the sun was Dio's one weakness as the vampire. And so in that way, it's kind of representing that Giorno isn't so much Dio's son as he is Jonathan's son, in my opinion. Like the thing that destroys the night and destroys the vampire is exactly what Giorno is. And it's the symbol of all of Giorno's virtues. And it's like, well, there you go. That basically speaks to his relationship with his two fathers, right? So that's also very fascinating. That's a really good frame. There's really good animation in this episode. I'm not sure what it is, but it's almost better than episode 1. Like, I've talked about Stan summoning animations for a bit too much of this series, but you know, you look at how Black Sabbath is summoned. Firstly, it's with ripples, which again, like I've talked about ripples in episode 2, so it's interesting that they bring it back here. You see like the flash of Black Sabbath's face. And then you see him emerging almost as a tornado. So, you know, that's really interesting that they've decided to summon him like this. And it's not just him, you know, like rushing out, but it's actually kind of like a spiral movement. Like that's really, really interesting. And I'm not sure what it's hinting at, but I think, you know, I was talking about in the Q&A video yesterday how Black Sabbath and Pulpo specifically are naturally destructive, right? Like they don't have any intention of serving up true justice or truly testing the applicants to Passione. And this is more just like a game to Pulpo. If you keep the lighter lit for 24 hours, you get in, and if not, you die. And it's like, okay. It's kind of like an abuse of power and authority, right? Like just because you have the ability to test your subordinates doesn't mean you should do something as cruel, in my opinion, as having them play this little trial of life and death. And, you know, especially for people like Mario who just get like roped into it just because they saw the lighter being lit, and Koichi as well, who comes in later, just because they saw the lighter being lit, they also have to have this trial of life and death. It's a very cruel game for Pulpo to be playing, and it's a very destructive and malevolent game. To represent that in a tornado is, I think, kind of fascinating. Obviously, tornadoes aren't malevolent, but they are destructive. I guess that's one way you can look at it. The other you know thing is why exactly they did decide to go with ripples. I mean, the last time I talked about ripples, it was in the context of Hamon and Giorno's connection to Jonathan, who was a master of the ripple in his own way. Here, you know, it's shown in a very tranquil and calm manner. The ripples don't represent the energy with which Black Sabbath erupts out from the shadow at all, and especially the aggression. If I clear this, and then I am very careful and pause it in. Whoa, look at that frame. Oh, that's brilliant. The calmness of the ripple imagery doesn't represent the aggression with which he immediately reaches out to Giorno at all and attacks him and basically tries to kill him right then and there. They're two very distinct and contradictory images, I think. So you have to wonder like why exactly they decided to go with the ripple imagery at all, because it seems to make so little sense with every other facet of Black Sabbath's imagery. I mean, ripples are obviously using the idea that, you know, it's water, right? So the shadows are kind of like this watery substance. So maybe you could say that Black Sabbath isn't actually hiding in the shadows, but instead is hiding in like a separate shadow space that you can only represent in, you know, the real world, the world of stone pavements on which shadows are projected onto, as, you know, like the surface of water. And it's kind of like Man in the Mirror in that way. Like what you see on the surface of the mirror is only a small part of the entirety of the mirror world, which Man in the Mirror like lords over essentially. Black Sabbath, I think, kind of exists in that other space as well. And the reason I'm being so insistent about this is because it further ties into the idea that I had of Black Sabbath being so divorced from Popo. Like, not at this point, not only is he a stand that is not controlled by Popo, and not only is he a stand that hides from other stand users, and so not only is he not physical, but he's also not visible within the non-physical world, right? But he's also hiding from the non-physical world. So it's so far removed from reality on so many different levels that it's really playing with some interesting ideas. And so that, I think, is what the ripple imagery ties into. But, you know, that's just the deep end of the speculation pool. So I'll just throw that out there, and I'll try not to talk about it too much. And I love this. I love the way that Black Sabbath just like paces around. I'm kind of a little bit confused by... that's an interesting frame. You know, Black Sabbath appears so patient and calculating just in the way he does that. It's really quite fascinating. When I make the point that it almost feels like Popo and Black Sabbath are two different personalities entirely, this is the kind of stuff that makes me feel like that. Popo, this sedentary, obese, food addict, versus Black Sabbath, this incredibly gaunt. You know, we talked about how skinny he was previously when his cloak was lifted. He's incredibly skinny, he's incredibly fast, and he's incredibly powerful as well. And also, you know, he's constantly on the move. He's like a lion waiting for the one calf to, you know, stray away from the pack so he can immediately pounce on him, just as you're seeing right here, actually. Like, look at that pounce. And see, look, he just crosses his arm and turns away. It's so good. Look at this, like a shark emerging out of the depths of the shadow realm, right? And it's not even alarming in any way. Like, the ripples are still so calm and tranquil, and, you know, he emerges without a sound, except for the SFX that the animators have put on top. See, and then Koichi gets dragged into this, and all he did was see the flame being relit. And so this ties back into what I was saying in episode 3, where it's like, when we saw that explosion of flame in the previous episode, it was more than just the gas in the area suddenly like exploding with the flame. I really think it was this super normal event. Hey guys, I'm in editing now, and I realized that I was having a lot of trouble phrasing the idea that was on my mind, and having had a few hours actually, since the time that I recorded this, and having played this idea through in my head a little bit, I just wanted to rephrase some of the stuff that I said. What I'm trying to say is, by witnessing the supernatural, you kind of acknowledge the supernatural within yourself, right? It's having seen it in the light of the flame. And that's the idea that I was talking about in episode 3. So if you're kind of confused on how I got that far, then you should probably watch episode 3. Having seen the lighter being relit, you kind of understand that there is a supernatural. And by acknowledging that much, you realize and comprehend that you also have an element of the supernatural. And so it's up to you at that point to decide where you want to go. Now that you have knowledge of the supernatural, how are you going to respond to that? And Black Sabbath, you know, says very clearly, you have two options. One is to take the stand arrow, which, as I said earlier in this video, is to accept the call that you are not as good as you could be. So it's kind of like this call that's having acknowledged the supernatural within yourself. You take up the challenge to strengthen that supernatural, thus producing the stand, right? And if you already have a stand, thus giving you, like if you're Kira, for example, you get Bite the Dust. Or if you use the Requiem arrow, you get the Requiem version of your stand, right? So you are psychologically in that position that you can be chosen by the stand arrow because you understand that you are not at the most successful place that your spirit can be, and you are longing to become a better person. Or on the other hand, if you don't feel that way, then you die. And I think that's such a gripping choice for Black Sabbath to put forward, because it's like, you know, you look at real life and it seems like an exaggeration to apply such a stark choice to real life. Like, either you succeed or you die, and well, you think about it and that's pretty much true. Like, either you succeed at doing something or you die without ever having succeeded at it. So, you know, that's an oversimplification, but it's a meaningful oversimplification because you can actually get, you know, something significant out of that. So that's kind of the idea that I was trying to get at, but it hadn't really matured in my mind just yet. And a lot of the ideas that I talk about in this series are just, you know, like they're coming out as I'm speaking. So apologies again if they really seem a bit random or I'm not really giving good examples of what I mean. But you know, that's why I want you guys to comment so you can talk about stuff that you don't think I really quite nailed. And B, that's why I have separate videos that I can make to better explore these ideas. Whereas this is just kind of like a quick glance at some of the crazy stuff that may not be immediately apparent, but by vocalizing them, I can get a better grasp of them. So yeah, let's go back to my original commentary. It's kind of like seeing your own potential, right? Like you are not just a regular human being living in a regular world. You are now in the world of stands. Your soul itself has power, and your spirit itself has been given form and shape and destructive capability. And either you can react to that positively, you can say, this is the potential that I must be living up to, and be willing to change yourself and to improve yourself, and that's what it means to be chosen by the arrow. Or you can say, well, it's just a regular event, and you can choose to be blind to what it means to see the flame being relit. I was talking about how the flame being relit is a symbol of not giving up, of a symbol of a greater willpower than just saying, well, I told Popo that I wouldn't let the flame go out. The flame has gone out, so I'm just going to tell Popo that I failed the test, right? Like, you have to have a greater willpower than that. And to witness the flame being relit is to witness that level of determination, to project yourself upon it and to realize that you are much greater than you could become. And that's the call to your spirit to manifest itself into a greater entity than it ever could have been previously. And that's what it means to have a stand. So, you know, that's why I think it's really interesting that just by seeing the flame, you are targeted by Black Sabbath, because it means that you have the potential to be awoken by the arrow. And it's all the more amazing that Koichi is the one who actually gets pulled into this, because Koichi, this is not Koichi's stand. Koichi's stand was an egg, alright? When it first came out, it was an egg. And then it became Act 1, and then it became Act 2, and then it became Act 3. So you wonder, you know, Koichi has lived up to that potential to such a great degree that you wonder if he had indeed been stabbed by this arrow, whether he would have gotten an Act 4. But I doubt it, because I do think, you know, the pinnacle for Koichi's character development already happened throughout Part 4. And like I said, I have a video on that, so you can watch that if you want, for an analysis with greater depth on what it means for Koichi's stand to have developed in this way. And another point that I mentioned previously, but I never got to talk about to such a degree, was Black Sabbath only attacks you not after you see the flame, but after you see the flame and then step back into the shadow. So what does that mean? Like Giorno, what does Giorno do? He sees Mario's death. And I am just going to keep calling him Mario because that is who he is to me. Especially in the colored scans, he's dressed with the same colors as Mario, so he really does look like Mario to me. And I've always thought of him as Mario. He's holding Mario's corpse, he sees the death that Black Sabbath brings and is immediately frightened and immediately starts backing off. And that's when he first steps into the shadow. So it's like, you can witness something as fantastic and amazing as the call to become a better person and to recognize your potential and to see the flame being relit, the flame of your soul, if you will, calling to you, saying that you can become a better person and you can strengthen your willpower and your soul and your spirit itself so that it manifests itself to the greatest possible degree, to the physical degree. Like, it actively affects the physical world and it can harm other people and it can also do great good to other people. But if you shy away from that and you step back into the shadows and you try to hide from it and you shelter yourself in the shadows, that's when Black Sabbath, you know, forces itself upon you and says, well, you have two paths. You can't back away from this. You've seen the potential that you can be as a human being. You can't say that you don't recognize it anymore. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to stab this arrow into your soul, and either you're going to come out of it a better person or you're going to die. And that's such a fascinating idea, isn't it? Because that's what people do, you know, like they challenge themselves. They say, I'm going to do something different, I'm going to do something new, I'm going to do something unique, and I'm not going to bore myself to death just doing the same things over and over again. Name me the person who will actively do nothing at all, or only the things that they're familiar with, for the sake of not harming themselves. And you found me someone who's incredibly unhappy with their life, in my opinion. And you found someone who's incredibly and profoundly unhappy with their life, in my opinion. So, you know, like humans undertake tasks that they believe to be difficult and they succeed at it, or else they die. Because, like, what other options do you have? You're gonna die regardless at some point in your life. So if you don't succeed at the things that you try your hand at, then you're just gonna die without having ever succeeded. You're gonna die only with your failures. So that's what Black Sabbath represents to me. I guess we've kind of resolved him into the threat of death without ever satisfying your potential. And the fact that it's tied to Polpo, who is the person that introduces people into Passione, which just happens to be Giorno's ambition and is where he is trying to become the most powerful person in all of Italy. You can string some of the ideas that I've laid out together in kind of like this network of ideas, if you will. And I don't really know how that would work out in the end. It'd be kind of a crazy network, considering all the stuff that I've talked about. And you know, you'd have to glue all the stuff that I talked about with the ripples and the tornado, and you have to talk about how Black Sabbath is representing in some way the distinction between the self and the soul, the ego and the id, and all this stuff. So it'd be kind of crazy to do that. And but if anyone's interested, then you're certainly welcome to. This is really interesting because in the manga, they actually show the arrow piercing straight through Giorno's hand. And is it his left hand that pierces in the manga? I forget. But for a long time in the old scans, people believed that this was a retcon that Araki did. Because people were like, well, if you get pierced by the stand arrow, that means you get a Requiem stand. But surely Giorno was pierced here and he didn't get a Requiem stand. But now it's like, maybe the Requiem arrow was different. Maybe, we were talking about this before. Maybe Giorno just wasn't worth being chosen to begin with. And that ambiguity has always been in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And this, does it really clear it up? I don't think it clears anything up, definitively, but it does clear some of the ambiguity, at least. I think what this really says is they're as concerned with some of the weirder parts of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure. And they're willing to indulge, or else be a bit worried about how fan theories will read in the anime, as much as any other JoJo reader, so that's quite interesting. That's a little bit disappointing, like the way they use digital to convert the banister, I guess. What would you call this? Anyway, the way it changed into these vines was, obviously digital and not very exciting, but the way these vines are animated looks really, really good. Well, I guess they're morning glories, aren't they? And it looks really, really good. The way the shadows play on Koichi looks so fantastic there. And some of this animation looks so good, but especially this art style in Giorno, like, wow, this is almost exactly what they promised with the key animation, the promotional arts, like just the way it's shaded, just the way the line art is so complicated. Like, look at how broken all those lines are, and the way like it's shaded, and it just looks so good. I love it. It's so good. The animation looks so like vivid and wild and looks so good. And again, him disappearing like a tornado, kind of recalling those ideas I was talking about. I love that you can just about see Black Sabbath's eye there, and it's not even looking at them. They're just having this conversation in the background. Black Sabbath's just waiting so patiently. Oh, what a cool stand. What a cool stand. See, again, like, what about this aesthetic says, there you go, that's a good looking pair of black eyes. Like, nothing about it, but it still looks bloody amazing. Nothing about the shading specifically, but it still looks perfect. I'm not sure what it is. If I did know, then like that would make me so happy, but I just don't know what it is. And there you go. This is the bleeding hand I was talking about. So this is one of the places where it makes sense to reference that bleeding hand. There's a couple more that I want to talk about, and I'll do that in the opening. But this is, when I first saw the bleeding hand, this was exactly the moment that I was talking about. This is the moment where we first see Giorno's ideals turning into a meaningful action, right? Like him protecting Koichi, and him trying to kill Black Sabbath because of the fact that Mario died and Giorno couldn't protect him from this destructive and malevolent stand, Black Sabbath. So if they really were referencing this bloody hand, then I'm really quite impressed with David Production, actually. But yeah, that's all stuff that I'll be talking about in the opening analysis. So that's, I'll talk about that more in due time. So here he actually gives a definition of what it means to be chosen, which, I mean, that's like the commonly accepted definition of what it means to be chosen. But then later on, when we get to the Requiem stand, it's like, does that make any sense at all? Like, why would the arrow choose certain people over others? And I think the speculation that I've done in this video kind of gets to the heart of the matter, rather than this very trivial explanation for what it means to be chosen. Here it is. This is the part where Koichi talks about Kira. Hype. So I don't really know what to think about this. I think it's a very brilliant touch by Araki to just have Koichi mention Kira without any great histrionics, right? He's not like, oh my god, it's just like, instead he's very calm and rational about it. And so, You know, you really get to see the influence that Jotaro has had on him, and that, you know, fateful summer of 1999, and how much it has caused Koichi to mature. It's really quite, it's a really cool thing to see, so yeah. Whoa, hype! I love the way they directed that, like just the way the sound design communicates like something's gone wrong. Really, really cool. And then this happens in really beautiful animation. And then the color swap, and just all of it is so good. Blue hair Giorno! Ah, hype! I really wish blue hair Giorno was just like the standard, to be honest, because pink and blue go together so well. They're really complementary colors. Not to mention that Black Sabbath is green and black. Oh, like that looks so good, and he has red eyes. Oh, that's precious. That's precious. And the stand arrow is blue, and it looks so good, metallic and cold. Wonderful. And then the music kicked in. Ah, well, I mean, I wouldn't say cringed, but I was a little bit upset that they would use the hype song in twice within the same episode. But now that I'm rewatching it, it doesn't feel as bad as I thought it was. And I really love that, like just the way the legs actually do crack, and you really believe it for a second. But then like Giorno doesn't yell or anything. But then you realize, oh no, it was the branch that was breaking. And then now you're like, wait, what? Like, now you're really in Koichi's perspective. Because you're like, what's going on? Nani ga okoteiru no ka wakaranai. And then you're like, oh, he's using the same ability that he used on Bruno, except it's on a tree, so it's just like surging with life energy. And then it dies from living too much. You wonder why he didn't just do this with some of his enemies, like give them so much life. But I guess, you know, there's a difference between a tree and a human being, you know, a human being having consciousness. So I guess we kind of saw the effects of what happens when he does this on a human being, and it's just like their senses go berserk. Whereas with a tree, which doesn't have a consciousness, it's just the life force gets immediately transmitted into an acceleration of its living state until eventually it just dies, which is kind of crazy when you think about it. That's like some of the really intelligent uses of stands that Araki really gets to writing starting from part 5. Like part 4 had some interesting and intelligent stand uses, but they were never really as situational as what we just saw there. So I think now we're really getting to the strengths of the stand fight system, let's say, which part 3, you know, was a far cry from. And part 4 was slowly building up to. And finally, you know, you get to actual problem solving. Like, how would you get to the tree that's 10 meters away with a stand that can only be 2 meters away from you? And it's like, well, the tree has roots. It's like, well, it's brilliant. And then we get this beautiful little animation. I love the way that Koichi just pops up here. It's very manga-esque, and it doesn't distract from all this, like, fiery, you know, deathing. Black Sabbath's fiery death happening in the background, but you know, you still get the intent of it, and you don't need like Koichi to take up the whole friggin' screen just to say, oh, you did it, right? So the line art looks so good. And then he reaches, and then brilliant. I scream. So yeah, this is the kind of stuff that I expect they'll correct in the Blu-rays, as opposed to adding additional keyframes or anything like that. Goal experience looks so good there. Look at that pose. Ah, beautiful pose. To me, this is an iconic part of the episode. I might make this a thumbnail, even though I don't think it quite accurately represents what the episode's about. It has the potential to become one of the, you know, the best frames in Vento Aureo so far. There's like 10 of these in this episode versus like 1 or 2 in the previous 3. So this episode in particular, I'm going to be a bit conflicted about which of the frames I can use as my thumbnail, but this one is certainly in the lead because it's such a badass frame and shots and cuts. Hell yeah.
一つだけだ。お前の行くべき道は。
And that's brilliant animation, look at that. Oh, that's too sexy. You can only have so much sexy in anime, unless you're JoJo, in which case you go big dick on the sexy. And there you go, so Sunset's finally resolved, and I really love how they've actually contained that sense of time. That's the first day of Vento Aureo, and these two characters have been central to it. And Koichi's going to retire from Part 5 soon, and indeed from all of JoJo's Bizarre Adventure, but this was a pretty damn good fight for him to have been in my opinion. And a very good representation of it in the anime as well. So, that's the first fight of Vento Aureo, and they certainly freaking nailed it, so I'm not complaining at all. Like, really, damn. And look, we finally get to see the actual... it's called Shadow Sabbath. We finally get to see like the actual character design thing for Black Sabbath. It looks actually a bit more ostentatious than it was in the anime, which normally these look really, really good. The only one I've really had a problem with in the anime was Killer Queen, because it looked a bit like demon-like or dog-like, depending on how you think of it. And this one, I don't know, something about it just looks a bit not threatening at all, whereas Black Sabbath, in, you know, as we've been seeing it for the past episode, really has this looming, overbearing and threatening aesthetic, and, you know, something about the way the eyes are bent downwards as though he's crying, something about the over open mouth, something about the way he's reaching. I don't know, it's just not threatening in my opinion. And also his legs are posed in an odd way, so I'm not sure how I feel about that. I like how Koichi slowly like develops his face as he runs towards the camera. I wonder how Koichi knows this. I mean, he hasn't really had any experience with stands where you defeat them, but then the user isn't like completely wrecked in some way. So like, and Black Sabbath especially had a very, you know, fiery and violent death, so to speak. So for Koichi to say that having seen, you know, that is really kind of odd, I think. So I wonder where Koichi actually got this level of knowledge about stands. Maybe he's been doing some research with the Speedwagon Foundation. Maybe he's met some other stand users in Morio, because that's certainly a possibility. And he's gained a bit more knowledge about what stand users are like, but then immediately afterwards he actually references Kira. So yeah, here he references Kira, so it's like maybe Koichi's only intuition about what stand fights are like still only comes from the events of Part 4, so, you know, that excuse kind of gets shut down as well. So it's kind of an odd thing for Koichi to be saying, but I guess for the purposes of continuing the narrative, there's really no one else other than Koichi who could have discussed all this. Maybe Giorno could have actually called Bruno, or else contacted him in some way about the fact that, you know, Pulpo has a stand. And then Bruno would maybe have been able to discuss that with him instead of having Koichi do this info dump. But in any case, like, this is the end of Koichi, so it's nice to be having at least one more final conversation, let's say, between the two of these characters. This is almost an identical shot to episode 3 when he first picks up the lighter, and he's a bit more like self-conscious about it. Like, he looks at the lighter and he turns away, but he's still like staring at it very intently. And finally, after he turns all the way, does he shift his gaze back to Pulpo. And I mentioned, you know, really liking that shot, so it's nice that they call back to it here with the same angle and the same perspective. And this time, like, it's a lot more of a determined gaze, and so really, really good. Here there's Pulpo's pizza scene, which I'd actually forgotten, but I still don't think they did it justice, and in fact it's a bit, they've actually made it more confusing than it was in the manga, so that's a bit of a failure on David Productions' part, I think. Like this entire wall here, like that's a pizza, and they don't communicate that at all, sadly. God, that's disgusting. And he even like burps, and it's like, ah, God, gross. So good job to the sound designers and the sound directors, I guess. This actually happens, so before you go into a test, always make sure that you haven't eaten for like a couple of hours at least, because then all the blood like rushes to your stomach for digestion and none of it goes to your brain. Fun facts! This looks so good. Wow, what a frame.
神は許してくれると思っている。それを忘れるな。おめでとう。君の入団を認めるよ。
Little sparkles. Okay, so that's really interesting what Pulpo just said. Because in a way, that is what Bruno's morality is. And, you know, I've been thinking about that a lot because, like I've been saying for so long, I have been planning to make a video on that. But, you know, you consider what Diavolo did against Bruno, and it really is a matter of insulting Bruno's trust. Also Trish's trust in a way. And using people as means to an end rather than as an end to themselves, which is a very Kantian idea, I believe. Disrespecting others. And Bruno specifically uses the phrase, "You've betrayed my heart a second time." And that's exactly what Pulpo is so discerningly saying, the only reason that you should be driven to fight or murder anyone else. In a way that is true, right? Like what Pulpo says isn't inherently wrong. It's just he's also a hypocrite and he'll do wrong things. So Giorno feels the need, as we see later in this episode, to deliver his own justice upon him. But I just think that's a really interesting idea, that in a way Pulpo's words here directly foreshadow the events of part 5 and the reasons why Bruno and the Gangstars step out from under Diavolo's thumb and decide to fight him directly. Because Diavolo is the kind of person who does abuse the intelligence and the willpower of others for his personal benefit, which, you know, is obviously insulting and belittling their independence and their intelligence. And it's also betraying the faith that these members of Passione have in the boss as their leader. Diavolo is only ever a tyrant to these people, and he's never like a wise and good ruler, as Giorno is eventually set up to be, or imagined to be, I guess. As we see him in Purple Haze Feedback, like that is exactly the character that he is. It's really interesting that Araki is willing to introduce this morality so early in the work, even though it won't have as meaningful an impact until like many chapters and like several volumes. And at least in the case of episodes, I'd say around like 15 episodes or so down the line is when we really see Pulpo's morality come to fruition. And yet here it is, and it's very easily spelt out. So it's really quality foreshadowing in my opinion. So yeah, that's the badge. This actually shows up in the ending theme, and back in episode 2 I was like, what is this? And someone in the comments actually did accurately point out that is the Passione badge. I didn't get to call them out though. And sadly, I don't have the comments at hand, otherwise I totally would call you out right now. But yeah, thank you very much for making that comment, because, well, obviously it was right. Actually, I find it interesting that that's not a CG object. Like, you'd expect something, you know, so physical and so dynamically animated to have been made CG, so, you know, you don't have to animate every little frame of this particular movement, and so you can just render it via computer. But they're actually willing to draw every frame of that by hand, so that's really interesting. And this is perhaps the coolest part of the episode. So if the previous frame that I talked about isn't going to be the thumbnail, then it's probably this, because, and like just that moment where Gold Experience like emerges out of Giorno's hand and he summons it, because it looks so good. The only problem is that it's actually a little bit challenging to pause it right there. Ah, God, that looks so... hype. Hype as shit, man. Hype as heck. With 2 C's. I like how Pulpo is... I mean, we've been talking about Pulpo's test like intensively for the past 2 episodes, and Pulpo himself doesn't even care about his test. Like, wow, that's kind of rubbing salt in the wounds, I think. So in the manga, I believe, he actually pulls a banana out right then and there, and then he actually shoots himself. By the time Giorno comes out of the cell, he actually turns around and he's like, that's what you get for insulting the lives of the innocent. But here they actually give it a little bit of time. They give him like 2 days for him to shoot himself, which is a bit more interesting, I think. The thing that I think is most interesting is that Giorno's Gold Experience power doesn't have a range limit on that case, and also doesn't have a time limit, so it literally will stay that way for 2 days, and no matter how far away Giorno goes, this doesn't accurately represent that at all. No matter how far away Giorno goes from the cell, like, that gun will remain a banana no matter what, so that's really interesting. So then we get this added scene, which gives Koichi a much better goodbye than whatever he got in the manga, so there's that. But also it kind of places a bit of the scenes out of order. And of course we get to see Jotaro one final time before the end of part 5. In my opinion, it gives the fact that Giorno is a member of, the Joestar family a bit more weight, because it's kind of like he's been accepted by Koichi, who has been audience to the Joestar drama, let's say, throughout part 4. And he understands their virtues almost better than they, because Koichi grew into those virtues, right? He became someone who practiced those virtues from, starting out as a coward, whereas the Joestars naturally have that within them as, well, that's like a qualifying trait of a Joestar. For Koichi to be the one saying Giorno is very much like a Joestar is, I think, a very profound statement. And then to separate that from all the other stuff to do with Black Sabbath, I think makes it a bit more profound, because it ties it a bit more intricately, and it's woven in a bit more into Giorno's story of becoming the gangster, right? Like, so he's finally entered Passione, but all of the virtue that Koichi saw in him in the previous chapter hasn't just disappeared. And the anime makes that very obvious by having Koichi's recognition of those virtues actually come after his entering Passione. So it's very deftly interwoven, I think. And, well, I'll talk about my next point later. This is really bad translation on the part of Crunchyroll. Does this Giorno kid really admire that? And it's like, what? What Koichi is really saying is like, is Giorno seriously admiring such a course of action? That course of action, of course, referencing being a gangstar, and Crunchyroll entirely ignores all of the subtext in what Koichi is actually saying and just goes for this incredibly lame literal translation. So, congratulations, Crunchyroll. Does this Giorno kid really admire that? Fucking kill me. This is a really hype moment in the manga because it really solidifies Giorno not as the son of Dio, which he is, but a member of the Joestar family, which he also is, right? So, we've seen Dio-like aspects of him, the way he says Muda, for example, and, the way his blonde hair is tied to his father, right? But now we're seeing aspects of Jonathan and the Joestar family kind of seeping into Giorno, and we see more of the moral ambiguity that is consistent throughout part 5, and especially centered around Giorno. And sad to say, I do agree with some of the people who are like, we never really get to see what's so interesting about a Joestar who also happens to be the son of Dio, and we never really get to see something that's so morally gripping and entertaining as a character of those two specific families and moral extremes, let's say, kind of being united into a single character. We never get to see that, but we do see it in extension throughout the entirety of part 5, so it excuses Giorno, in my opinion. And in any case, we do get really awesome moments like this, where we see the Joestar family lined up as kind of like holy spirits of your ancestors, beaming down at you from above and saying, you are following the right path. So, like, what else could you really ask for? It takes a really long time to build up to it, though, which I thought was a bit weird. Like, I thought they'd be willing to show the image immediately, but they're really, like, building it up. And this is really hype. I mean, maybe this will be my thumbnail. I don't know. It's probably going to be this, because this is such a defining moments of early part 5 at any rate. Like, this establishment of Giorno as one of the Joestars. And I really love, it's kind of odd to see this from Koichi's perspective, but we see Joseph from part 3. But I really love that they did go Joseph from part 3, and not Joseph from part 2, and not Joseph from part 4. Because, in my opinion, that's exactly the point where Joseph was most heroic. In part 2, he was really only doing it because he was the only one who could, in a certain way. Like, he's a user of Hamon, and yeah, like, he wants to protect Speedwagon and he wants to protect his mother, but it's kind of like this proactive brashness rather than like an informed emotional response to a very prominent threat against his family members. And guess what part 3 is? Well, it's exactly that. It's his daughter who's gonna die in 50 days, and that's a much more profound place for Joseph to act from than just saying, well, there's these crazy pillar men that are trying to take over the world, so I might as well fight against them, I guess. Right? So for me, Joseph in part 3 is like absolutely the best Joseph. And he has his merits in part 4, but it's not as strong as his merits in part 3. Also, I love that they're all drawn in the part 5 art style. Now, granted, this is early part 4, so in a way, this is actually what Josuke should have looked throughout, like late part 4 at the very least. Like, this is exactly the art style that Araki still had in late part 4. So it's nice to see that, actually. Like, we don't get the part 4 anime specific art approximation of Araki's style, but it actually is like a very close reproduction of what Josuke looked like in those last chapters of part 4, and certainly in the particular in this panel that we get in part 5, Josuke looks almost exactly like this, so that's really exciting to see. Nothing to say on Jotaro, to be honest. I guess he is wearing his part 5 outfit, and we've already talked about that in episode 1, so no big surprises there. Wow. And so yeah, finally we're 2 days in, and Giorno shows Bruno the badge. And finally, oh, we get to see the gang stars. But first. Hey guys, it's me from editing again. I did mention that I had this other point that I wanted to talk about, but I actually completely forgot when I was recording this, so I'll just say it here instead. The scene immediately after, you know, the way the anime orders it, Koichi recognizes Giorno's position in the Joestar family, let's say, and his role in the Joestar pantheon, if you will. The very next scene, after Koichi recognizes his virtue in that way, is the scene where he cold-bloodedly kills Polpo. Which I think is such a cool juxtaposition, and I really love the fact that they contrasted those two scenes like that. And so it's when I say that David Production really deftly wove the scene of, you know, the Joestars kind of hovering above Giorno in spirit form, I really mean it, right? Like it really is deftly woven, and it's such a powerful thing to see when you like draw attention to it, that even though, yeah, he is a virtuous person, and you see the same righteousness in him as you see in Joseph and Jotaro and Josuke, you still see some of the cruelty and some of the underhandedness that Dio used, right? And so I think it's really interesting that, you know, just because we see it from Koichi's perspective, we don't see Jonathan in that, even though Jonathan is his biological father. To show Jonathan, I think you would have to show Dio as well, because both of those are such great and powerful components of who Giorno is and the way he acts and his morality, how his morality is exercised. I think it's so fascinating that Jonathan, the greatest, the goodest Joestar, isn't there at all, even though he's closest to Giorno, because equivalently you could say that Dio is the closest to Giorno. So it's like, which one do you prioritize? And it's like, well, neither. You don't show either of them. And I just think that's so cool. And I forgot to mention it probably because, you know, hype for the banana scene. So I'll let you guys listen to my thoughts about that now. Yeah, so like 2 days after this first happened, you know, Giorno was last here. It's really odd to imagine that Gold Experience had such a reach in both time and space to be able to keep that banana as a, to be able to keep that pistol as a banana for so long and so believably. I love Giorno's sass. Ah, beautiful animation. That's why I changed one of your guns into a banana. It's your last meal. Enjoy it! 10 out of 10. Probably one of my favorite moments in all of JoJo. And in fact, you know, when I first got into JoJo, I found one of those like collections where it's of panels from the manga where it's like, here's a bunch of JoJo panels out of context, and one of them was that, like, that's why I turned one of your guns into a banana. It's your last meal, enjoy it. I hadn't read the manga at that point. I was only about like halfway through the part 3 anime, which was airing at the time, and in fact it was the divide between the first half and the second half of the part 3 anime, so I was really starved for JoJo content, and I didn't want to read the manga because I wanted the part 3 anime to finish. So I just found like a bunch of memes, and eventually I found that panel, and I was so taken by it. Like, I thought it was the funniest thing in the world, and I still think it's really quite humorous, just to take it out of context. And even now, like even in context, I still think it's a very funny situation for Polpo to have died in such a way. That's not really any point that I'm trying to make, rather than just my journey through the JoJo fandom when I was first getting in. So yeah. Okay, and now finally we have the Gangstars. Abakio, Mr. Fugo Narancha, here they come, boys. To be continued. It's too hype. It's too hype. So once again, I'm gonna skip the ending theme. I will try and find. Right. So there you go. This is the Passione badge that I was talking about, and indeed, that is exactly what it was. I mean, it's not a shape that you really quite associate with part 5, right? Because you only ever see it like that one time. And you know, you never see Giorno wearing it on his label or something. You never see any of the other gang members having it. Like, this is just the one time you see it, and they're really making it quite prominent for this ending theme. Like, it's right here at the end, and it takes up like probably the biggest amount of space that any of these background screens take up. So it's really quite fascinating that they focus so much on it when it's such a trivial and small amount of small focus of what part 5 is actually about. I guess you guys can join me next episode, if you so desire, for episode 5, Find Pulpo's Fortune. We're finally getting introduced to the gang. Piss drinking boys, it's gonna happen, and I'm very, very excited. You know, the jellyfish hype is absolutely real. And of course, they'll probably take the boat to Capri, which means whether they take a picture or not is absolutely contingent, in my opinion, on whether David Production have a Purple Haze feedback anime adaptation planned. So if they take the picture next episode, it's like, boom, hype, Purple Haze feedback coming your way sometime next year. But if they don't, then it's still a bit more up in the air. And in fact, at that point, I'd be willing to, you know, squash my hopes and say, well, if we get it, then we're quite fortunate, but I doubt it's coming now. So that's all next week. If you guys are still watching this, then I really don't know what to say. I'm really quite blessed to have an audience such as you guys. Definitely leave a like if you enjoyed the video, or I don't need to describe YouTube to you, but I don't feel like enough people are communicating ways that I can improve, or ways that I am misconstruing some of the stuff that I'm talking about. So certainly, like, leave a comment if you think that I've, you know, said something wrong and some of my speculation has, you know, been a bit inept, let's say. Or if you think that this whole enterprise is a bit flawed, then, you know, you can leave a dislike perhaps, and you can talk about, you know, what you'd rather like to see in terms of these kinds of analyses. And I can tell, once again, my voice is like dead. So I've talked way too much again. As much as my ego likes to think that I have nothing to say, my id is so involved in JoJo's Bizarre Adventure that it just spouts words as soon as it gets the opportunity. So I guess I don't really know myself as well as I thought I did. And that's why I'm not one of the chosen ones, and that's why I don't have a stand, guys. As ashamed to say that as I am. But that's fine, I can work on my breathing to train my ham on. See, that's the thing though, like, what if I'm in the Steel Ball Run universe, actually? Well, no, I can't be, because Funny Valentine was never a president, so that's fine, that's fine, that's fine. But yeah, no, certainly comments. If you guys didn't know, and I've already talked about it like 2 or 3 times in this particular episode, so you probably know, but if you somehow missed that, then I am doing like kind of a comment reaction video series where I look at certain comments and I react to them in a separate video, and you can watch the first one that I did, and I released it only yesterday. You can watch that one and tell me what you think, because it's really an interesting way to introduce your discussions to the series that I'm doing. And it, you know, when I described it as ancillary in that video, and I really think it will be a good way to support these Vento Aureo episodic analyses, to not just have my voice ranting over every single one of these episodes, but also to introduce your guys' voice. So the more comments that you guys leave on these videos, the more that I can introduce to those videos and the better discussions we can have, and that's going to be really, really hype. Finally, if you guys are excited for new videos, especially on Bruno's morality, especially on the second look at the opening, then certainly subscribe, because those are all videos that are going to be coming out within the next week. And of course, you know, episode 5, as we've been talking about, that's going to be really, really exciting to watch with our introduction to Abakio and Mista and Narancia and Fugo, and it's going to be so, so, so good. So yeah, I'll see you guys next week with episode 5. And until then, a Halloween video may or may not be coming out. So yeah, stay excited for all of that, and I'll see you in those videos. Take care, everyone.